raise your hand. You can raise your hand if you have a question, or you can just put it in the chat. So here's our plan for the day. I've got sort of 8 sections, most of them quite short. We'll be toggling back and forth between PowerPoint and our Oxygen XML editor. I want to start off with why we annotate, mainly for the benefit of our newest editors and our student team members. Then I'll talk about the types of annotations that we can make in LEMDO. The third thing is the basic model for the annotation. Fourth, how we add anchors to the modern text. Fifth, how we point to the string that we want to annotate. You want to annotate. There's my first typo. 6, how to make an annotations file. 7, the difference in our digital and print publication series when it comes to annotations. And then finally, some resources. So once again, if you have questions, you can ask as you go or type in the chat. I've made Mark Kaethler co-host, so he will alert me if there are questions. Number 1 then, why do we annotate? In a good scholarly critical edition, there are lots of reasons why we might provide annotations, and every series, which in this case is each anthology, will make some project level decisions about how much annotation is appropriate and what kinds of things need to be annotated. The most basic kind of annotation aims to gloss words and phrases for the user. I think of our target user of the editions as the third-year student. Certainly they have value for students at other levels and for scholars, but we tend to pitch our annotations for the third-year student, or glosses at least. Second, to contextualize our emendations and situate them ideologically. So I'm editing Merchant of Venice, and I have a fairly lengthy commentary note on how people have commented on the word complexion in Portia's comment about Morocco. Third, we want to acknowledge our sources in ways that the collation cannot accommodate. So sometimes we've been inspired by scholars to do certain things with our texts, and we want to give credit where credit is due. 4, we use the annotations to discuss points of textual history, again, things that can't be captured in the collation. 5, to offer commentary and point users to resources and criticism. 6, especially for our QME folks, to record performance discoveries through performance as research exercises, and performance histories, that should say performance histories. And 7, to pedagogical guidance. So LEMDO's created a series of types of annotations that aim to make it possible to do those types of things. We have 6 types of annotations. Taxonomy argued over and thought through and eventually agreed upon by a number of people on the editorial side. The gloss, the commentary, the textual note, the lexical note, pedagogical note, and performance note. And I'll go through each of these in more detail. But first, I want to just show you how these compare to the ISE levels. If you edited for the ISE, you'll remember that there were 3 levels of annotations: note level 1, note level 2, and note level 3. There was a 4th type of annotation added so that we could capture the results of performance as research exercises, and that was level equals performance. The level, ISE level 1 is more or less equivalent to the LEMDO note type equals gloss. Levels 2 and 3 were designed mainly to help us figure out whether something should appear in the online edition and the Broadview edition, or whether it should just appear online. So the note level equals 2 annotations were designed to be online and in print. And the level 3 were generally not included in the Broadview editions. So the fundamental difference between them was a difference of length. LEMDO is not concerned about length. What it is concerned about is the type of information that is given in the annotation. So our distinctions are content-based rather than length-based. We have note type equals commentary, note type equals textual, and note type equals lexical, all of which might have been level 2 or level 3 in the ISE texts. We still have performance notes, but we've added a new type for pedagogical notes, which are not required, but are simply available. So let me run through these. These are the definitions that we give in our schema. The note type equals gloss is a short note that gives a short description of the term, generally a single word or a single phrase that aims to provide a paraphrase. The commentary note is a discussion of the meaning of the text, roughly equivalent to current annotation in editions like the Arden or New Cambridge, and these can be as long as you need them to be. Note type equals textual explains textual decisions made in the present and previous editions. Often they will be designed to say more than the collation can offer. The pedagogical note, our new type, is designed to offer teaching tips and strategies, often with links to pedagogical materials. And for Kate, this is something you might want to know about, because I'm hoping that people who write pedagogical notes will be making links to Emmy from those notes. What we have right now are a series of pedagogical notes that have been added to editions by other people. It's been piloted by Jeremy Ehrlich, who many of you know from his years at the Folger and his long involvement with the Internet Shakespeare editions. He is a brilliant teacher of Shakespeare, and we're very happy to be publishing his teaching notes. Editors can provide teaching notes if they wish, or they can be added to texts later, either by the same editor or by anybody else. Performance notes describe performances or production choices in specific productions named in the production database. That is LEMDO's. It's not exactly equivalent to the Shakespeare and Performance database that the ISE offered. It's more like a bibliography. We list only productions that people actually talk about. Productions cited in the performance essay and or made in performances research productions that were part of the editorial process. So for the plays that have been edited with performance and experimentation in the rehearsal hall as part of the editorial process, they'll want to capture the thinking that emerged from the performances. You can see wonderful examples of those on the QME website. Lexical notes. We noticed that a lot of editors were really enjoying digging into the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm enjoying digging into lexicons of early modern English, which I'm really encouraging everybody to use in addition to the Oxford English Dictionary. If you find yourself going off on an etymological tangent, the place for it is a lexical note, where you can discuss the etymology of a word or phrase and or its meaning and prevalence in the early modern period. And you'll usually be citing the Oxford English Dictionary and or Lexicons of Early Modern English, which is an open access resource based at the University of Toronto, offering almost 2,000 dictionaries up to the year 1800. So it's very important that you talk to your anthology lead. So your anthology lead will decide which types of annotations you should be using. They will set the style of the annotations, and they will have something to say about length. So just to explain the relationship between LEMDO and the anthologies, we're here at UVic providing technical support and a platform. We have a set of encoding guidelines, but there is latitude for the anthologies to make their own editorial decisions. So LEMDO needs to be able to support multiple possibilities, but we don't require that you use them all. We don't prescribe them, and we don't tell you how to use them. Moving on to the basic annotation. So this is what the basic annotation looks like in XML. There are a few more details that we'll add to the entry, but this is what we call the content model. The entire annotation is contained within a note element. That's the opening tag for the note element, and there's the closing tag for that note element. And nested inside it are multiple other note elements. The first one is always note type equals label, and you put the lemma, the string of words that you're annotating, or more to the point, just a really short little anchoring phrase inside the text node of that element. And then after that, you can have 1, 2, or all the way up to 6 types of notes on that particular word or phrase. So you may well want to add a gloss on a word, as well as a commentary note and a performance note. You know, you can go as deep into a particularly rich passage as you want. So that's the content model. There's a little screenshot from the actual Oxygen file where you can see a real annotation, which is an annotation of the word invention from James Murdoch's edition of Henry V. There's a gloss, and there's also a commentary note on that word. So the lemma you want to keep relatively brief, 2 to 3 words is ideal. Remember that this will show up at the bottom of the page in a print edition. It is no longer necessary to type out the phrase that you are annotating exactly as it appears in the modern edition. We're not using string matching. So this fairly long phrase, I can't remember what comes in the middle, you would pick the first word and the last word of the string that you want to say something about, and you would omit the material in the middle by using the ellipsis character. The ellipsis character is built into Oxygen to make it really easy for you to put it in there. It's space, ellipsis character, space. For those of you who remember all of the trials and tribulations of string matching, you'll be really glad that we've gotten rid of that. Your edition would have failed if the content of your lemma didn't exactly match your modern text, which meant that annotations files and modern text would sometimes get out of sync, and then we would have to go and check the annotation to figure out why the build was breaking. So we're not using string matching, which is quite fragile. But we do have diagnostics that check your lemma against your text. So if you happen to misspell famine in your note type equals label, we would flag for you that it didn't match what your modern text said. So that's a way of helping us avoid spelling mistakes and errors, but it won't fail the build because we are not relying on string matching to put annotations and the modern text together. So the other part of the annotation is these notes. Note type equals gloss, note type equals commentary. You can write whatever you want in the text node there. And moving on to number 4, since we're not relying on string matching, how do we actually connect your annotations to your modern text? What we do is we use anchors on either side of the string. The string is a word or a phrase that we want to annotate. So the ISE was relying on string matching, which meant that the server had to match up the string in the annotation lemma with the string in the modern text in real time. The server had to do that every single time somebody called up annotations. LEMDO uses anchors. This is, if you know TEI well, this is the double endpoint attachment method. And it's laborious, but it is very robust, whereas the ISE string matching method was fragile. The ISE's method was server dependent, so you could never remove the addition from the server that was serving it up, whereas a TEI edition prepared on the LEMDO platform has no server-side dependencies, so you can download it to your device and run it without even an internet connection if necessary. All of which is to say that it's worth the effort it takes to add these anchors. Here's an example of text with an anchor on either side. So here is the word cockpit from the opening chorus of Henry V in James Murdoch's edition. And you can see that there's an anchor element on each side of that word. The way that the anchor is formulated, we have the anchor element, we have an XML ID attribute, and then we have the value of the XML ID attribute being this long, funny looking string of text. And then we have another anchor element with its own XML ID attribute and a value. I'll talk about how those values are constructed in a moment. But what I want you to notice at this point is that this word cockpit is not wrapped in an element. We're not actually saying anything about the word cockpit here. All we are doing is dropping a milestone element before and after the word. These are self-closing elements. There's a slash at the end there indicating that this element is not wrapped around anything. It's just a waypoint in the text. So the double endpoint attachment method is asking you to put one milestone element before and one milestone element after. All they're doing is marking 2 points in the text. They're not saying anything about the word cockpit. We're going to toggle over to oxygen. As you can imagine, quick little shortcuts for you all across the LEMDO Oxygen project, and this is one of my favorites because of the time it saves. So I'll read the instructions, then we'll toggle over to oxygen and we'll actually do it. So find the lemma that you want to annotate, the word or phrase. You just highlight it with your mouse, type Control+A, and it will add the anchors for you. If it's the first time you're adding anchors to a text, you'll need to add the 1 and the 2 on the end, but every subsequent anchor that gets added to the text will be given a unique number for you. So let's toggle over to oxygen now.
Janelle, there's a question in the chat.
Okay. Let me get to a point where I can actually see the chat. There we go. Jesus points out that the second milestone refers to another play. Oh, right. This is just me not editing my slides thoroughly. There we go. It is the same play. Okay. I'll go over this again, but the anchor is constructed from the name of the file that the anchor is in. And then we add A and C for anchor underscore, and then 35 is the number of the anchor. And I'll explain why it's so long in a minute. Lean had the same question and Mark has helpfully answered it. Thank you. All right, so I'm looking at my screen, which is displaying a little chunk of text from James Murdoch's edition of Henry V. I'm going to make it a little bigger here. That command, there we go. Okay, so as you can see, it already has quite a few anchors in it. There is our word cockpit with the anchors on either side of it. So what if at this point, James decided that he wanted to annotate the word cram? So he could simply highlight it, press Shift Control A. I'm about to answer your question, Helen. And you can see that it puts the anchors in for us. And the next available anchor number happens to be 6,364. And because we're adding 2 of them, 1 on each side of the word, we have 6365. So Helen asked what happens when you add another note later. These do not have to be consecutive. They can jump all over the place because the only real point here is that they're unique. At processing time, they get turned into sequentially numbered notes. So, and Laura asks, shouldn't the first anchor always be an odd number? No, because sometimes we're reusing anchors that are already there for the collations. So you'd only need to add one anchor then instead of two. And sometimes we have an anchor that just marks one single point in the text. So for example, if you wanted to make a note that a word seemed to be missing somewhere, there's nothing to wrap around. You just say at this point, something seems to be missing. That might be particularly valuable for the manuscript text. And Tom asks if the anchor numbers are specific to the play being edited. Yes. So one of the things about an XML ID, for those of you who are interested in XML languages generally, is that they have to be unique across the entire project. So obviously many texts are going to have an anchor number 34. So how do we make sure that anchor 34 is unique across the entire project? We construct the anchor by beginning it with the name of the file, which is unique across the entire project already. Okay, so you use something that's unique to the project already, the name of the file, and then you can add anchors. So I'll show you what happens if we try to reuse an anchor. We should get an error message. It's going to take a while because it's such a huge file. There we go. You can see we've got a validation error and it's flagging for us that we've already used anchor 34. Okay, those of you who painstakingly renumbered anchors for the ISE will appreciate that these do not have to be consecutive. Tom says yes. Thank you, Tom. So so that's quite a nice feature that you can add those anchors anywhere you want. If you only wanted one anchor, our little Oxygen tool is set up to put in 2 anchors. So if you only wanted one, you would just delete the second one. And then when you went on to anchor something else, it would pull up the next available number. So it's a very smart little tool. I'm going to undo everything I've done because I'm sure James doesn't want us to mess up his text. There we go. Back to my slides. So this slide addresses the question that you've just asked about the anchors. How do we construct the anchor? It does have to be unique across the entire project. You cannot replicate an XML ID. And so the file name is EMD for Early Modern Drama. Then the standard abbreviation for the play. We're continuing to use the abbreviations that the ISE was already using for non-Shakespeare plays. We have a fairly long list from Digital Renaissance editions with suggested abbreviations, and LEMDO will adopt those. Underscore FM stands for Folio Modern, because in this case, there's also a modern edition of the quarto text, which is, as you know, quite different from the folio text of Henry V. So the anchor XML IDs then pick up the name of the file, add an underscore, ANC for anchor, another underscore, and a number. And they will be added to your file in consecutive order, even if you aren't placing them in consecutive order. Tom asked if anchors can go inside anchors. That's a great question, and I'm going to toggle back to Oxygen to answer it. So because an anchor is a milestone element, it doesn't have any child elements. XML is hierarchical. It has parent and children elements. Children nest inside parents. But when you have a milestone element like this, it doesn't have any children elements. So you could add another anchor after this one, but you can't add an anchor inside it. If you were thinking of a specific use case, Tom, you could unmute and explain what you were thinking about.
Well, I was wondering about the instance where you have one annotation for a whole phrase and then another annotation for a word inside that phrase. So what's the syntax for doing that?
The syntax is, let's see. Okay, so here's a case here where the editor is annotating your imaginary forces.
Right.
Okay. But if you also wanted to annotate forces, this would be one of those cases where you would insert a single anchor. You wouldn't need both of them. Okay. So you could have a separate note element that would point to anchor 3634 and anchor 55.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. I understand, because sometimes you want a textual note on an individual word, but you're also glossing the entire phrase.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So you just put anchors in all the places you need them. And once you're doing annotations, you've probably already done your collation, so you can reuse the anchors that are already there for your collations, adding any new ones that you need.
Oh, that's clever. Okay.
Yeah. An anchor is an anchor is an anchor is an anchor. All it does is mark a point in the text, and then you can use that anchor in multiple different places across the website to point to that piece of your text. We also use them in the critical paratext if you want to cite something. We're drawing on those anchors in some cases. Okay, we'll undo that. There we go. Thanks, Tom. That was a good question. A few tips. You can add anchors before you modernize the text. You can add them while you are modernizing the text, or you can add them after you modernize the text. Anchors do not have to be consecutive, which means you can add new anchors at any time. It's often the case that editors get all the way to Act 5 and then decide that they want to add a few more annotations to Act 1. Don't worry, just use the next available number, even if it's 6,000. The processor is perfectly capable of coping with that. And note, as we've seen, you can use the same anchors for multiple purposes. So if the anchors are already there for your collations, you can reuse them for your annotations. If you already have an anchor in place to annotate a phrase, you can use that same anchor to annotate a single word within that phrase. You may have to add an additional anchor, but you don't need to add two anchors in exactly the same spot. That one anchor can be used for lots of different things. Okay, how are we doing? Any questions on that? I'll move on to number 5 then. Point to the string you want to annotate. So once we've put those anchors in place, we need to have a way of pointing to them from other documents. So here is the content model for the note. So the anchors go in your modern text. The notes are going to go in another file, which we're going to call the annotations file, and we will make one of those files shortly. The content model for a note in that annotations file is note type equals annotation. And then we have a target attribute and a target end attribute. This is the double point endpoint attachment method described by the TEI. So our target attribute has as its value the anchor that's before the string that we want to annotate, and the target end attribute has as its value the anchor that comes after the string that we want to annotate. Okay, so essentially we're doing the string matching ourselves. We're not expecting the processor to match up bits of text. We're saying, I want to make an annotation from this point to this point. The computer doesn't have to think very hard. So there's the 3 attributes spelled out. We need an @type attribute, which will always have the value of annotation. And then we need that target attribute and that target end attribute, each of which will have the value of the target of the anchor that we want to point to. Amoga asks if the target and target end values have to be consecutive numbers. They don't. We can have an annotation from anchor 3 to anchor 5. We can have an annotation from anchor 6552 to anchor 43. So again, what matters is that those anchors are unique places in the text, but they don't have to be consecutive. Okay, so now we need to add the value to the target attribute. And there's a reason why I just gave you this simple content model first before we cluttered it up with the actual values. So here at the bottom of the slide is a picture of what the actual note looks like with the 3 attributes in place and the values of the target and target end attributes. Let's break down the target attribute. So we need to point to the document that has the anchor first. LEMDO uses prefixes just to speed up processing time. And so we need to use the prefix doc, which is a way of saying go and look in the document collection, as opposed to the personography or the prosopography or the bibliography or the orgography or the handography for the manuscript folks. Okay, so we use that doc prefix right there with a colon, and then we need the name of the file that contains the anchor. In the case of Henry V, it's going to be EMD H5 _ FM for Folio Modern. Once we've identified the document that contains the anchor, we then need to add the XML ID of the anchor. We use the hashtag to say to the processor, now that you're in this file, go and look for the XML ID in this file. The hashtag always says, go and look in the file that we're already in or that I've just sent you to. And here's the XML ID of the anchor, EMD H5 _ FM for Folio Modern _ ANC _ 34. It looks redundant, but it isn't. Remember that each of those anchors has to be unique across the project. We make sure they're unique by using the name of the file as part of the XML ID of the anchor. And so yes, we are repeating EMD H5 _ FM, but that is the only way that we have any hope of creating unique XML IDs across a project that could potentially have 2,500 plays someday. So we're planning for a massive scale. Okay. And likewise, the target end attribute would have exactly the same thing. I've gone too far here, sorry. And I've got another typo. I'll fix these up before I circulate them. I'll fix the 3 typos that I've now noticed. So the target end attribute works exactly the same way. We add the doc prefix, the name of the file containing the anchor, the hash character to say, look in this file for this XML ID, and then the XML ID of the anchor. Any questions about that? Okay, we will move on. So number 6. So how do you make an annotations file? I'm going to go through the instructions and then we're actually going to do it. So LEMDO has created for you a number of template files, which means you can create a brand new file in Oxygen, and the basic encoding will already be in place for you. We have made 5 or 6 templates now, and we're making more. So the idea is that if you're a new editor, you're never starting from a blank XML file. You're starting from a template that has the basic encoding in place and lots of instructions. So the instructions are on this slide, just so that when you are looking at the slides again in the future, you can walk through this process. So we're going to go to Oxygen. We're going to open up the file menu, click on New, click on Framework Templates, click on LEMDO, and click on Annotations Template. We will do that in about 1 minute. But first, a little note that Oxygen only offers up the LEMDO templates if you have opened up the LEMDO all XPR file when you start working, which you should always be doing anyway. But this is one of the reasons why you want to do that. If you open up LEMDO all.xpr, you have access to all of the tools and keyboard shortcuts and little tricks that we've built for you. If you're not working in LEMDO all.xpr, you can still validate against our schema, but you don't have access to the little tools that we've built for you. There are instructions on the LEMDO dev website about how to use our templates. So now we're going to toggle over to Oxygen, and we're going to make a template. We're going to use the template to make an annotations file for Much Ado About Nothing. I picked that one because the editor hasn't created the file yet, or I haven't created it for her. Okay, so just a little note about the structure of the repository. There's a giant text directory, and inside the text directory, there is a directory. We're calling it portfolio for clarity. There's a portfolio for every single play. So Much Ado About Nothing has its own portfolio. Inside it are 4 folders. There's an app folder, which is going to contain the apparatus files. And as you can see, the only one here now is the collation file. There's the crit folder where the critical paratext will go. There's the main folder where the 3 texts live, including the modern text of Much Ado About Nothing. And then there's another folder for supplementary materials, if there are any. LEMDO's not encouraging supplementary materials, but if you have them, or if they were already published on the old site, we will include them. So what we want to do now is make that apparatus file, which is going to live in this app folder here. So following the instructions on the slide we just looked at, I go up to the File menu. I click New. And now I get a bunch of options here for files that I can make. I want to go down to Framework Templates, click on LEMDO, and you can see that there are a number of templates that you can choose from. I'm going to open up the Annotations template, click on it, and create a template. And you'll notice that it comes up as an untitled file, untitled 1. So one of the first things I need to do is give it a name. And I'm going to give it an XML ID. XML IDs are used across the project. You have an XML ID. I think Comb, yours is SAIGSIEJ 1, numeral I'm JEN's 1. So this is a concept that we use across the project to make entities unique and distinguishable and linkable. So we need to give this file an XML ID, and we are going to use the name of the file that we want to annotate to start our XML ID. So EMD ado _M _ annotation. So that's going to be our XML ID for this file. And we also need to save it. in the right place. So I'm going to do a save as, and I'm going to put it in the right folder. It needs to go in the app folder. And I want to give it the same name as that XML ID. And now my red squiggly line will go away. We have a rule in LEMDO that the name of the file has to be the same as the XML ID that we give this particular document. So going back up to the top, you'll see lots of things that are colored green in Oxygen. These are all comments for you. And as you work through them, you can delete them. There should be in every template a link to documentation that will help you through this process. Okay, these are not hyperlinked because they're in XML comments, but you can copy them into a browser, click on it, and then it'll load the page. So we've already done this step. We've saved this file to the app folder. The file name, protocol is explained. We've already changed the XML ID. I can delete that too. And then you can just work through the instructions. I'm going to pass over the TEI header though, because the metadata is always the hardest part. We'll come back to that. In the text element of this file, we have a body element, and every single annotations file across the project is going to have a div type equals annotations. So I have said, do not alter the div element, just leave it as it is. And here we have sample annotations, which you can delete as you go. They're for my edition of Crusoe Thriambos, and they're just little models that you can look at if it's helpful and then delete them as you go. I also kept in one of my own kind of over the top lexical notes, because there's a word in my show that doesn't show up anywhere else until the 19th century when it gets reborrowed back into French. And I also have a great grandfather named Cuthbert Orfer, who was a goldsmith in France. So this is a word I really like. So I went all out, and I'm sure that my coordinating editor is going to tell me to cut it down. But I just wanted to show you what you can do with a note type equals lexical. So if you want, you can copy this content model and just start filling it in. You know, you probably won't be using all of these every time, but at a bare minimum, you're probably going to have you have to have the note type equals label. Gloss will probably be the one you most commonly use. And now you can go and grab the anchors. If you want to save time, what you could do is put in the name of the file that you're annotating. Actually, we're going to need to do this. Because remember, we need the file name in there. That'll save you a lot of time. Then you just copy that over and over again, and you drop the anchor numbers in there. So let's make our first annotation for this file. The editor is Nancy Wright, who's one of my colleagues here at UVic. She is building on the excellent work of Cliff Werrier and Gretchen Minton, who have handed over the edition to her with some advice for her to help her finish this. So if you wanted to say something about the word Messina, for example, we would go into our modern text. We can add anchors around the word Messina, one on either side of it, by typing Control-Shift-A. And it looks like we had already added 2 anchors. We'd already added anchor 1 and anchor 2. So the next available numbers are 3 and anchor 4. We can now go back to our file, annotations file, put in the anchor numbers. And then we can write a gloss. That's a silly gloss, but you get the idea. There you go. There is an annotation that is pointing to anchors 3 and anchors 4, anchor 4 in the modern text of Much Ado About Nothing. Before we move on to the difference between digital and print, are there any questions about how to do that? Okay, I will move on and we will have time for questions at the end if you think of any. So part 7, digital versus print publication. If you don't know already, we do have a print publication series lined up, and our intention is to produce a print edition of every play that we publish digitally. So that will be particularly valuable for early career scholars, people coming up for tenure and promotion deadlines, scholars on the job market. You really do want something in print that you can give people. It will also be useful for who really prefer to have something that looks like a print book. So, you know, obviously things like my very long lexical note on the word orfevrerie is not going to go into the print edition. So we made some strategic decisions about what would go in the print edition and what would go in the digital edition. Glosses go in both the digital and print edition by default. Commentary notes also go in the digital and the print edition by default, but you can add a subtype attribute to indicate if something should be print only or online only. I will toggle back to Oxygen to show you what that looks like in the annotations for Henry V. So with the permission of James, while we were remediating this edition, because he had given things levels, I had to make some decisions about what they were going to be called in the new taxonomy. And I also had to make some decisions about what was going to go in the print version and what was going to go in the online version. So we've set the length of the print annotation at 225 characters. We experimented a little bit with that, and it seemed to work in almost every single case when we set it at 225. So that is the limit. And if you type more characters, you actually get a little note saying that your commentary note is too long. So print only and online only are really useful if what you want to do is have just the first part of the note appear in print, but also retain a much longer note on the online version. So if you did not add a subtype here, this commentary note would show up both in the print edition and online by default. But you can see what we've done in this particular instance is we've created a short print only note for the book and a longer online only note for the digital edition. And the first sentence of the online only one is exactly the same as the first sentence of the print only one. But because it's online only and there's no limit on length, the editor can go on to say more. So as I'm remediating, I'm retroactively making these decisions about the text in conjunction with the editor. But if you're editing your play in TEI, you might actually want to be thinking about what you want to give a reader who's working with the print edition, and knowing that that print user is probably going to be a student and their professor, but also allowing yourself this little extra length to write longer notes. Back to the slides. Textual notes are digital by default. We made the decision that the print editions are meant to be for classroom users. They can always go and look at the textual notes online if they want to, or if the professor wants to direct them to those notes, but they will not appear in the print edition. Likewise, lexical notes will not appear in the print edition. Pedagogical, same. Performance notes will depend on the anthology. So I imagine for QME, who have used the performances research methodology to create their editions, the performance notes will appear in their print editions, but other anthologies might make different choices about that. Here's a sample page from one of our forthcoming print editions. You can see how those annotations are showing up in the print edition. Those anchors, which can be any weird number, get converted at build time into numbers, and then numbers at the bottom of the page with these short notes. And here you can see why you want to use ellipses rather than spell out exactly the contents of your lemma. Famine, fire is a little bit more elegant than famine, comma, sword, comma, and fire. We try to keep it to 2 or 3 words just to keep things tidy at the bottom of the page. And they also look nicer in the pop-up boxes on the digital site. Okay, and now these are the links that close. So I just wanted to show you our print series. We're using UVick's e-publishing service, and we will have our own series within this. So there will be a button that people can click on and go directly to our series. So under books, this menu will become overview, recent titles, forthcoming titles, LEMDO, backlist, catalog, order our books. So I wanted to show you some of the things that they're doing. This is a recent publication. And you can open up the book like that. It's got a cover. Thank you for admiring, Laura. They're trialing Manifold right now. Manifold is really nice because you can actually annotate this with your students. So our solution to the annotation from a desire to annotate your own text is that we are going to be publishing on Manifold. We're also publishing in multiple other ways. So, oops, I've gone too far. This is the one I like looking at. Narratives of Memory, Migration, and Xenophobia in the European Union and Canada. If what you want to do is download the print book to your computer, you can do that. Now you have a lovely PDF of a print book, which you can read on your screen or any other device. And if you want to buy the book, you can also do that. You can order a paperback. Yes, these texts are free, but if you want to buy it print on demand, then there's a cost for paper and production. Okay, so if you wanted to order print copies for your classroom, you could do that. We're not getting any revenue from this because partly because we're a grant-funded project, and partly because redistribution of revenue is complicated. But the print on demand does allow people who want to have a physical book in their hands to do that. If you want print copies for your tenure dossier or promotion dossier, or to give to your family members. It's available, and also our project is really committed to open access. So we have issued commercial publication. We are using all of the resources of UVic ePublishing, which has actually won a couple of awards for open educational resource publication, and just continuing to make our texts available freely in an open access way. And Laura notes that this complies with tri-agency open access policies. Those of you who know me well know that I've been all about open access and using or sharing our scholarship with the public in the most open way possible ever since I started working as a professor. I feel very strongly that we're paid by the public and our work needs to go back to the public. Now, what makes this feasible is that we are generating our own PDFs. So this is a little, we're going to pop the hood on Jenkins, the continuous integration server that builds our projects. One of the things that Jenkins builds for us is PDFs, and they are built from the same underlying XML that builds our websites. So those of you who remember the Broadview ISE partnership, absolutely beautiful books. I love Broadview. I order their books as often as I can, but we did have a bit of a problem in that Broadview had its own peer review and copy editing process. And so the online texts and the Broadview texts would drift apart over time, especially as people continued to work on the digital edition. We generate our print text from exactly the same underlying code as the digital edition. And so there will never be a point where the print edition and the online edition get out of sync. In fact, once the edition is printed and line numbers are stabilized, that's something that happens at the point of printing. Once those line numbers are stabilized, then we will actually add those line numbers back to the digital edition. So good practice is that you want to point from the least stable thing, which is the digital edition, to the most stable thing, which is the print edition. So we're trying really hard to keep them in sync, or we are trying to maintain some control over the print process while still having these things have all the legitimacy of a university press, which is the University of Victoria. And I've been in conversation with UVic about this for a long time. This is going to be the flagship series for UVic ePublishing, and I hope that it will become the go-to place for people who are looking for open access textbooks. And, you know, I hope that we might even win an award for this. Open educational resources are much in demand right now, especially in the wake of the pandemic. And they also check a bunch of boxes for accessibility and you know, global sharing of resources. Okay, so they look pretty nice. I have Martin Holmes to thank for this. He used a digital typesetting program called LaTeX to turn our underlying XML into books that look pretty nice. We're still thinking about fonts and trim size and margin size, what we do with running titles, but we're getting really close to being able to release these. So back to my slides. The last couple of slides here have resources for you. So we will send you these slides. And when you're at home and you're trying to remind yourself how to do this, you can click on these links and go to the documentation. So really our documentation takes three forms. There is documentation in the form of written documentation. Nicole Vatcher, who's on this call, has been writing documentation with me for the last couple of years now. I think we've got something like 19 chapters or up to about 800 pages. Everything is documented up, down, and sideways with lists and tables and clear instructions. It can always be better, so you can give us feedback as you use it. The second form of documentation comes in the form of the LEMDO TEI schema, and that's what produces those pop-up messages when you're working in Oxygen. So use those messages to guide you, because they're actually written by me to help you as you're encoding. And the third form of documentation is that template file, which is full of XML comments, those things that show up in green and are designed to guide you as you are completing that file and adding information about your particular play and adding your annotations. If you need one-on-one help after that, do please email me or the project manager or the LEMDO Tech account. The LEMDO Tech account can be monitored by the RAs. So if I take a holiday this summer, as I hope to do, somebody will still be available to answer your questions. Finally, acknowledgements. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my wonderful team. Kim and Amoga and Nicole and Navarra were on this call. Navarra's off to a class. The LEMDO group is all the co-applicants on our current SSHRC Partnership Development Grant, and that includes Laura Estel and Kate McPherson and Helen Ostovich on this grant, on this call, I mean, and Mark Kaethler. Martin Holmes, who's my developer colleague, students, Joey Takita and Tracy Alhaj, who also worked on the developing. And of course, UVic is offering us an awful lot of in-kind support, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada handed us $200,000 a few years ago. And that's what we've been using to build LEMDO and remediate all of the ISE, QME, and DRE texts. All right, so feel free to turn your video back on, and we will pause the recording here and